I spent 40 years dragging a multi-million-dollar empire out of the mud, only for my own son to poison my scotch and sign me into a living grave where the world would forget my name. Julian thought he was upgrading the family business by erasing the man who built it, but he forgot one thing. I didn't start in a boardroom. I started in the gutters. I'm back now, not as a father, but as the ghost of every sin I committed to give him a life of luxury. This is the story of how I systematically dismantled my son's world, leaving him with nothing but the debt he owes me, paid in blood and iron. My name is Silas Vance. If you saw me on the street 40 years ago, you wouldn't have given me a second look. I was the guy covered in grease, smelling like diesel and old metal, hauling scrap in a truck that had more rust than paint. I didn't have a fancy degree or a silver spoon. What I had was a pair of hands that didn't mind getting dirty and a gut that could handle the pressure. I built Vance Industrial one piece of rebar at a time. I worked through winters that froze the breath in my lungs and summers that turned the scrap yards into ovens. By the time I hit 50, I didn't just own the scrap yards. I owned the steel mills, the shipping lanes, and the very skyline of this city. I was the king of a mountain made of iron. Then there was Julian, my only son, my pride, and as it turns out, my greatest mistake. I wanted him to have everything I didn't. I sent him to the best boarding schools, bought him the fastest cars, and made sure his hands stayed soft. I thought I was protecting him from the hardness of the world, but all I was doing was making him feel entitled to it. He grew up looking at the empire I built not as a responsibility, but as a throne that was rightfully his. He didn't understand that you don't just own a company like mine. You have to lead it. You have to earn the respect of the men who move the steel. But Julian didn't want respect. He wanted power. And he didn't want to wait for me to die to get it. The signs were there, looking back. Small things. He started bringing in these consultants, sharks in expensive suits who talked about efficiency and asset liquidation. They looked at my life's work like it was just numbers on a spreadsheet. I told Julian to get rid of them, that we did things with handshakes and loyalty. He'd just smile that cold, polished smile and say, "The world is changing, Dad. You're just a bit out of touch." I laughed it off. I thought he was just being young and ambitious. I didn't realize he was already measuring me for a coffin. It all came to a head on a Tuesday night. Julian invited me over to the penthouse I bought him for his 30th birthday. He said he wanted to celebrate a new contract, a massive deal that would take the company global. I walked in, feeling like a proud father. The city lights were twinkling behind the floor-to-ceiling glass, and the room smelled like expensive cigars and success. Julian poured me a glass of my favorite scotch, a 30-year-old Macallanide, saved for a special occasion. We sat in the leather chairs, and he raised his glass. "To the old man," he said, his eyes fixed on mine. "The man who built it all." I took a long sip. The scotch was smooth, but within seconds, something felt wrong. A strange heat started in the back of my throat and spread down to my chest. It wasn't the burn of alcohol. It was a heavy, numbing sensation. I tried to set the glass down, but my hand wouldn't move. It felt like it belonged to someone else. My heart started to thud against my ribs like a trapped bird. I tried to speak, but my tongue felt like a thick piece of carpet in my mouth. I looked at Julian, expecting to see panic on his face, expecting him to call for help. But he just sat there. He didn't move. He watched me with a terrifying calmness, sipping his own drink. The room started to spin. The lights of the city blurred into long, ugly streaks of yellow and white. I felt myself sliding off the chair, my body hitting the floor with a dull thud I couldn't even feel. I was paralyzed, my eyes locked open, staring up at my son as he stood over me. "The board needs a leader who can see the future, Dad," Julian said. His voice sounded like it was coming from the bottom of a deep well. "Not a fossil who still thinks a handshake means something. You become a liability. You're slow, you're stubborn, and you're in the way. Don't worry, though. I've taken care of everything. The doctors, the paperwork, the diagnosis. To the world, Silas Vance has finally lost his mind. You're going to a nice place, a quiet place, where you can't hurt yourself or the company anymore." I wanted to scream. I wanted to wrap my hand around his neck and show him exactly how much life was left in this fossil. But I couldn't even blink. I lay there on the expensive rug, listening to the sound of my own shallow breathing, as Julian picked up his phone and made a call. "He's ready," he said. "Send the team up." When I woke up, the world was white. White walls, white ceiling, white sheets. The air was thick with the smell of bleach and something sickly sweet, like rotting flowers. My head felt like it had been cracked open and filled with lead. I tried to sit up, but my arms were strapped to the sides of the bed. I was in a room that looked like a high-end hotel, but felt like a tomb. This was Pine Ridge, a memory care facility for the ultra-wealthy. It was where people sent the parents they didn't want to deal with anymore, a place where you were fed, washed, and drugged until you forgot who you were. For the first few weeks, they kept me in a chemical fog. They'd come in 3 times a day and force pills down my throat. If I fought, they'd call in a man named Miller, a massive orderly with a neck as thick as a tree trunk and eyes that enjoyed the struggle. He'd pin me down while the nurses did their work. I was a king who had been stripped of his crown and thrown into a dungeon. I watched the clock on the wall, the seconds ticking away as my empire was being dismantled miles away. I could almost hear Julian's voice in my head, laughing as he signed away everything I bled for. But Julian made a fatal mistake. He thought I was just a businessman. He forgot that before I was CEO, I was a survivor. I knew how to play a part. One morning, I didn't fight. I let them put the pills in my mouth. I kept my tongue flat and my throat closed. The moment the nurse turned her back to grab a cup of water, I tucked the pills into the small pocket between my gum and my cheek. I swallowed the water, smiled a vacant, empty smile, and waited. As soon as they left and the door clicked shut, I spit the half-dissolved pills into a tissue and flushed them down the toilet. I did this for days, then weeks. Slowly, the fog began to lift. My mind sharpened. My muscles, which had started to waste away, began to crave movement. I started doing silent exercises in the middle of the night, push-ups against the bed frame, leg lifts under the covers. I was building myself back up, one hidden movement at a time. I watched the guards. I learned the shift changes. I learned that Miller liked to sneak in a break room at 2:15 a.m. to smoke a cigarette by the back vent. I learned that the head nurse, a woman who looked like she hadn't smiled since the 70s, kept the master key card on a lanyard that hung just a bit too low on her hip. Before we continue, kindly hit the subscribe button to catch more stories like this. And drop a comment to let me know where you're watching from. I'll love to hear. The night of my escape was the coldest night of the year. I waited until I heard the faint click of the 2 a.m. rounds. I lay perfectly still, my eyes squeezed shut, breathing in the slow, heavy rhythm of a man deep in a drug-induced sleep. When the door opened and the light from the hallway hit my face, I didn't flinch. I felt the nurse step close to the bed, heard the scratch of her pen as she checked her clipboard. She didn't even touch me. Why would she? I was just a vegetable to her. The moment she turned to leave, I moved. It wasn't the movement of a 60-year-old man. It was the movement of a predator. I slipped out of the restraints. I'd been loosening the bolts on the bed frame with a plastic spoon for 10 days. I was behind her before she could even scream. I didn't want to hurt her, but I needed that card. I pressed a hand over her mouth and whispered in her ear, not a sound, "And you go home tonight." Her eyes were wide with the terror I'd seen in 100 boardrooms. She nodded frantically. I took the key card from her neck and used the zip ties she kept in her pocket to secure her hands to the bed. I gagged her with a pillowcase, checked the hallway, and slipped out. The facility was quiet, filled with the low hum of industrial heaters and the distant moans of people who had truly lost their minds. I felt a pang of guilt for leaving them, but I had a mission. I wasn't just escaping. I was going to war. I made it to the laundry chute and slid down to the basement. The air was colder there, smelling of wet concrete and soap. I found a service exit, swiped the card, and stepped out into the night. The rain was turning to sleet, stinging my skin, but it felt like the most beautiful thing I'd ever felt. I was free. I had no shoes, just thin hospital socks, and I was wearing nothing but a thin gown and a stolen jacket, but I started running. I ran until my lungs burned and my feet were numb. I didn't go to the police. I didn't go to my lawyers. I knew Julian had eyes everywhere. Instead, I went to the one place nobody would think to look for Silas Vance. I went to Iron Pete's scrapyard on the edge of the docks. Pete and I had started together in the 70s. He was a mountain of a man with a beard full of metal shavings and a heart made of actual gold. I hammered on the door of his trailer until he opened it, a shotgun in his hand and a snarl on his face. When he saw me standing there, shivering, bleeding, looking like a ghost, he dropped the gun. "Silas," he breathed, his voice like gravel. "The news said, they said you were in a coma in some fancy clinic in the Alps. The only thing in a coma is my mercy, Pete," I said, my voice cracking. "I need help. I need a phone. I need a pair of boots. And I need to know everything my son has done in the last 90 days. Pete didn't ask questions. He pulled me inside, wrapped me in a grease-stained blanket, and handed me a cup of coffee that tasted like heaven and battery acid. For the next 5 hours, we sat in that cramped trailer, and Pete told me the truth. It was worse than I thought. Julian wasn't just running the company. He was killing it. He had fired the old guard, the men who had built the mills with me. He was selling off the land to developers and moving the operations overseas where he could use cheap labor and cut corners. He was taking the Vance name and dragging it through the mud just to pad his bank account. He was planning to liquidate the entire company by the end of the month and move to a tax haven in Europe. He thought he was being smart. He thought he was being a shark, but he forgot that a shark is only dangerous until the water runs out. I spent the next week living in Pete's yard. I lived in the shadows, eating canned soup and wearing work clothes that smelled of oil. I didn't mind. It reminded me of where I came from. It reminded me of why I was strong. Using a burner phone and Pete's old contacts, I started digging. I found the offshore accounts Julian had been using. I found the consultants he was paying under the table. I found the doctor at Pine Ridge who had signed the fake papers, a man with a gambling debt that Julian had quietly paid off. I had everything I needed to put Julian in prison for the rest of his life. But as I sat there in that scrapyard, surrounded by the twisted metal of things that used to be whole, I realized that prison wasn't enough. Julian didn't fear the law. He feared losing his status. He feared being nobody. He had tried to erase me, to make me a ghost in my own life. So, I decided I was going to return the favor. I wasn't going to just take the company back. I was going to let him watch as I burned his new world to the ground, piece by piece, until there was nothing left but the ashes of his arrogance. I started with his fiancée, a woman named Clara who had appeared the moment I fell ill. She was a socialite, the kind of person who only breathed air that had been filtered through money. I knew she didn't love Julian. She loved the Vance fortune. I sent her a simple anonymous file, photos and bank statements of Julian's secret life, the other women, the money he was siphoning off into accounts she would never see. By the next morning, she had packed her bags and cleared out his personal safe. Next, I went after his business partners. I called in every favor I'd earned in 40 years. I spoke to the union leaders, the shipping magnates, the steel suppliers. I told them I was alive. I told them the truth. One by one, they pulled their support. Julian's massive global deal started to crumble. The stock price began a slow, agonizing crawl downward. He was scrambling, trying to plug the leaks, not realizing that the entire ship was already underwater. Finally, I was ready for the end. I waited until the night before the final liquidation vote. Julian was at the penthouse, probably drinking that same Macallan, thinking he was hours away from his final victory. I walked up to the front of the building. I didn't sneak in this time. I walked right through the front door. The doorman, a man I'd known for 10 years, looked at me and turned white as a sheet. "Mr. Vance," he whispered. "I'm just here to see my son, Arthur," I said, my voice calm and cold. "Don't bother calling up. I wanted to be a surprise." I took the elevator to the top floor. The doors opened, and the penthouse was quiet. I walked into the living room. Julian was sitting in my chair, staring out at the city. He didn't hear me at first. I stood there for a moment, looking at the back of his head, remembering the boy he used to be. I felt a momentary flash of sadness, a wish that things could have been different. But then I remembered the taste of that scotch. I remembered the white walls of Pine Ridge. I remembered the way he had looked at me while I lay paralyzed on the floor. The sadness died. Only the iron was left. It's a long way down, isn't it, Julian? I said. He froze. I saw his shoulders lock. Slowly, very slowly, he turned the chair around. His face went from confusion to shock, and then to a terror so deep it looked like he was being physically crushed. The glass in his hand shattered on the floor, just like it had months ago. But this time I wasn't the one on the ground. Dad, he gasped. His voice was a thin, pathetic reed. Al, you're supposed to be. I'm supposed to be forgotten, I said, taking a step toward him. But you forgot one thing, son. You can't bury a man who knows how to dig. Julian didn't move. He looked like a man who had seen a ghost. And in a way, he had. I was the ghost of the man he thought he'd buried, the ghost of the empire he was trying to sell off, and the ghost of the father he had betrayed for a few extra zeros in a bank account. He was trembling so hard that the shards of the shattered glass at his feet rattled against the floorboards. I took another step into the room, and the light from the city behind him caught the iron in my eyes. I didn't feel like a father anymore. I felt like the scrap hauler I used to be, cold, hard, and ready to break anything that stood in my way. Julian's mouth opened and closed, but no sound came out. He looked at the door, then at the phone on the desk, then back at me. He was calculating, even now. He was wondering if he could call security, if he could lie his way out of this, or if he could convince me that it was all just a big misunderstanding. But I knew that look. I'd seen it in the eyes of every crooked contractor and shady dealer I'd ever stepped on to build Vance Industrial. Don't bother with the phone, Julian, I said, my voice low and steady. Arthur at the front desk isn't going to help you. Miller at Pine Ridge isn't going to help you. And those high-priced lawyers you've been using to bleed my company dry, they're currently busy answering calls from the district attorney's office. Julian finally found his voice, but it was weak and high-pitched. Dad, you don't understand. I did it for us. The company was failing. I had to make the hard choices you were too soft to make. I was going to bring you home as soon as things settled down. I swear. I laughed, and it was a sound that didn't have any joy in it. It was the sound of metal grinding on metal. You think I'm as stupid as you are, boy? I spent weeks in that white room, listening to the nurses talk. I heard how you paid off the board. I saw the records of the money you moved into that Cayman account. You weren't saving the company. You were stripping it like a stolen car in a chop shop. You didn't care about US. You only cared about Julian. He took a step back, his face turning from pale to a desperate, ugly red. So what now? You going to kill me? You going to go to the police and tell them your son tried to lock you away? Good luck with that. I have the papers. I have the doctors. You're legally incompetent, Silas. To the world, you're just a crazy old man who escaped a clinic. You walk out that door, and they'll put you right back in a gown. I reached into the pocket of my grease-stained jacket and pulled out a small, black digital recorder. I pressed play. Julian's own voice filled the room, cold and sharp. The board needs a leader who can see the future, Dad. Not a fossil. Enjoy the rest. You've earned it. The color drained from Julian's face again. He stared at the recorder like it was a live grenade. I didn't just escape, Julian, I said. I went back to the source. I went to the doctor you paid off. Turns out, a man like that doesn't have much loyalty once he hears his medical license is on the line. He gave me everything. The emails, the wire transfer records, the original diagnosis that he never actually performed. And Miller? The guy who liked to hit the patients? He's a lot more talkative when you're the one holding the leverage. I walked over to the desk and leaned on it, my face inches from his. I've spent the last week with Pete at the scrapyard. We didn't just look at your bank accounts. We looked at your partners. Those consultants you brought in, they aren't businessmen. They're vultures I ran out of this city 20 years ago. They thought they could sneak back in through you. But they forgot who owns the ground they're standing on. Julian tried to lunge for the recorder, his hands clawing at the air, but I was faster. I caught his wrist in a grip that had spent 40 years hauling steel. I twisted it just enough to make him cry out and drop to his knees. I wasn't the fossil he thought I was. I was the man who had built a kingdom out of nothing, and I still had the strength of the furnace in my bones. Listen to me carefully, I whispered, my voice cutting through his whimpering. By tomorrow morning, the global deal you're so proud of will be dead. I've already spoken to the union. They're going on strike at midnight. The shipping lanes? Closed. The mills? Cold. You have nothing to sell because nobody is working for you. And the bank? I bought your debt, Julian. Every cent you borrowed to pay off those board members is now owned by a shell company controlled by me. I'm not just your father anymore. I'm your landlord, your banker, and your judge. Julian was sobbing now, the tears streaming down his face, ruining the expensive silk of his tie. Please, Dad, don't do this. I'll give it back. I'll sign everything over. Just don't let them take me to jail. I can't survive in there. I let go of his wrist, and he slumped onto the floor, a pathetic heap of a man. I looked around the penthouse. The expensive art, the designer furniture, the floor-to-ceiling windows. All of it had been bought with my blood and his greed. It felt like a tomb. It wasn't a home. It was just a monument to a legacy that had gone rotten. You're right about one thing, Julian, I said, walking toward the window. You wouldn't survive in jail. But that's not where you're going. I'm not going to call the police. That would be too easy. I'm going to let the world see who you really are. I've already sent the files to the news. By the time the sun comes up, every headline in this city will have your name on it. The son who sold his father. You won't be able to walk into a restaurant, a club, or a boardroom without everyone knowing exactly what kind of snake you are. I turned back to him. He was looking up at me, his eyes full of a hollow, empty fear. I'm taking the company back, Julian, but not for me. I'm turning it into a cooperative. The men who actually move the steel, the ones you try to fire, they're the owners now. I'm going to spend the rest of my days making sure every one of them has a pension and a future. And you're going back to where I started, but without the heart or the hands to make it work. I reached into my pocket and threw a small bundle of cash onto the floor next to him. That's $500. That's more than I had when I started Vance Industrial. Consider it your inheritance. The penthouse is being seized at noon. The cars are gone. The accounts are frozen. You have 6 hours to pack a bag and get out. Julian didn't say anything. He just stared at the money, the reality of his downfall finally sinking in. He had tried to play the game of kings, but he had forgotten that the king was still in the room. I walked toward the door, my footsteps heavy and sure. I didn't feel the weight of my age anymore. I felt lighter than I had in years. I had lost a son, but I had found my soul again. I had spent so long building a mountain of iron that I'd forgotten what it was like to stand on the solid ground. As I stepped into the elevator, I looked back one last time. Julian was still on the floor, surrounded by the broken glass and the broken dreams of a life he never earned. The doors slid shut, and I felt the smooth descent back to the street level. The lobby was empty when I stepped out. The doorman, Arthur, wouldn't meet my eye. He knew. Everyone would know soon. I walked out into the cool night air. The rain had stopped, and the city felt fresh and clean. I started walking toward the docks, toward Pete's yard. I didn't have a car, and I didn't have a penthouse, but for the first time in 40 years, I wasn't carrying the weight of the kingdom on my back. I reached the scrap yard as the first light of dawn began to gray the sky. Pete was sitting on the steps of his trailer, a pot of coffee brewing inside. He looked up and saw me, a slow, knowing grin spreading across his face. Is it done, Silas? He asked. It's done, Pete, I said, sitting down next to him. The iron is back in the furnace. Now we just have to see what comes out when it cools. We sat there in silence, watching the sun rise over the city. I knew there would be a long road ahead. Lawyers to deal with, a company to restructure, a reputation to rebuild. But I wasn't worried. I'd started with nothing once before, and I knew exactly how to do it again. Only this time, I wasn't building for a son who didn't deserve it. I was building for the men who had stood by me when the world thought I was a ghost. Julian would spend the rest of his life in the shadow of the man he tried to erase. He would learn what it felt like to be invisible, to be a nobody in a city that used to bow to him. It was a brutal revenge, but it was a fair one. He wanted me to be forgotten, so I made sure the only thing the world would remember about him was his shame. As the city began to wake up, the sound of the mills started to echo across the water. It was a deep, rhythmic thrum, the heartbeat of a kingdom that was finally finding its pulse again. I closed my eyes and breathed in the smell of the river and the rust. I was home. The debt was paid. The iron was settled. And the ghost of Silas Vance was finally at peace. Before we continue, kindly hit the subscribe button to catch more stories like this. And drop a comment to let me know where you're watching from. I'll love to hear.